Hello, this is Mel Thompson, and this is a podcast and a series of podcasts about political risk. Today I'll be discussing the Iranian situation when it comes to getting into Cuba. You probably thought that was going to go in a different direction, the Iranian situation. Well, it did not. It actually went in a direction that you could see coming, but you were hoping was never going to happen. What I'm talking about particularly is the Iranian government is now making diplomatic headway in Cuba. While the United States is still tied to the same Cold War doctrine that should hinder Iran rather than embolden it, the Iranians are about to make a fortune in Cuba. I speak, of course, of the embargo which remains even though we have resumed diplomatic ties and limited travel to Cuba by U.S. citizens and companies. Now, obviously, the embargo needs to be lifted by Congress, but the other things that have been going on have been done through executive order. So therefore, this problem lies now directly in the lap of Congress. Now, Iran has sent a delegation that is going to set up shop right in our backyard, which is exactly what the Soviets did, but with missiles. And now we have an embargo that should have precluded the Iranians from doing the same thing. The Monroe Doctrine, don't come into our neighborhood. The Iranians don't care. They just don't care. It's a different time, and they look at the situation between Cuba and the United States right now, and they realize the United States has got more of an interest in getting trade going with Cuba than it does in getting making a political point by keeping this embargo in place. Now, in the case of Cuba, the situation is so unique that there must be a compromise reached that takes into consideration the views of the Cuban government, yet is consistent with international law and the Calvo Doctrine. By Cuban governmental views, I specifically mean saving face. There has been no just compensation paid, and the plan that was floated many years ago by Cuba to bond out payments that would take care of the damage caused by any expropriation during the Cuban Revolution has never been taken up and taken seriously by the United States. The Calvo Doctrine basically is a doctrine that is saying, in certain terms, that just compensation is something that needs to be done, not discussed, not a theory. Just compensation needs to be paid to U.S. companies and individuals who were stuck and then ceremoniously kicked out of Cuba or had to leave Cuba very quickly in 1959, leaving behind money, leaving behind property, and have never been compensated for it. So the fact that this problem has not been resolved, meaning the Cuban government has not done anything to repair that economic damage, is, in my opinion, the holdup for Congress really to having the political cover to lift the embargo. Once there's compensation paid and the Cubans say we're sorry, I don't see how Congress can maintain this embargo, particularly when the argument can be on the other side politically that, the Iranians are there. So I do believe that Cuba needs to move on this, and the United States needs to be open-minded as far as lifting the embargo if just compensation is paid to foreign direct investors and companies from this country. But this message needs to be sent very, very forcefully and calmly and quietly to the Cuban government so they understand that if they go down this road, they're going to be rewarded. And so are our people by getting their just payment for what they lost and what was done to them many, many years ago. To give you an idea of what the problem basically is going to be, you need to look at the fact that the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act, also known as the Helms-Burton Act, is what is holding the embargo in place. It's going to take an act of individuals in Congress to lift that act. The U.S. is in a box, and it can't get out of this box unless we know that Cuba is going to reciprocate somehow. The bonding out of payments, tax plans, all these things are great ideas, but unless the Cubans know that Helms-Burton is going to be lifted and that the votes are there to lift it, they're not going to lift a finger. They can have everything on the table, everything ready to go. We can have everything ready to go on the table. But the will of Congress, if it is there, is what is the tipping point, one way or the other. The issue before the United States and Cuba is not compensation only. It is what is the long-term relationship financially going to be between Cuba, Cuban nationals who are now here, and other stakeholders that can actually be of benefit economically to Cuba and to the United States by being active in the trade with them. One more thing you need to understand, and this is a good example of why this needs to be done now and why the Iranians are an excellent warning sign. German exports to Iran, mostly machines and equipment, have gone up. They went up quite a bit in the first half of the year. This was right after the sanctions on Iran were lifted. Now, exports to Cuba of Iranian goods all of a sudden are probably going to go up. Why do you think? Because the Iranians now feel emboldened. They can actually trade. The international community is starting to lift up some of the pressure upon them. And one of the first things they do is come into our backyard because they know we can't do more than what the executive branch has already allowed through executive order. We cannot have full, open financial and diplomatic relations with the Cubans until Helms-Burton is lifted. And that, as I said previously, is going to take the act of Congress. And that is not something that's easy in this polarized situation that this country now finds itself. This is not about politics. This is about basic economics. This is about a embargo that has never worked. It's not going to work. But I've always maintained the people who are harmed by the revolution need to get paid. They need just compensation, and then Helms-Burton should be lifted. We need to get to the point where these two things are on the table, it's public, and it's going to be done. If one is not there, the other one is not going to be there. And that's what this all comes down to. And it needs to be done sooner rather than later, because if not, Iran is going to steal our thunder, and they're already starting to rain on our parade. This has been Mel Thompson.